Hi there, my name is Emma and welcome to my channel. I make videos on art, upcycling, and DIYs, so if that interests you, feel free to subscribe. On today's video, I am going to show you how I made a Dungeons & Dragons dice tower out of polymer clay and cardboard. Before we get started, please excuse the mess. I hate this part. I've had this video filmed for weeks and I hate recording my face, and if I procrastinate any longer, it's never going to get filmed. So we're just gonna ignore the background and focus on the content of this video, which is a Dungeons & Dragons dice tower. Now, I must admit, I don't personally play Dungeons & Dragons, but our friend who watched our dog while we were on vacation does, and this was a gift for him, so we're very grateful to him. And he mentioned that he didn't have one, and I had this idea, like the whole premise of this was based on creating a customizable tower, and it didn't really end up being super customizable. The goal was to put magnets, which I did, in the top of the tower, so on the different campaigns it could be customized. So if there's like a specific theme, like one with like a dragon or a polar bear, you could create different creatures or banners or shields or whatever you want to customize it, and it could all connect to the magnets on top of the tower. Now, I made this as a gift, but also to inspire you. So hopefully, although I didn't end up having time to create any additional elements for this tower, hopefully this technique inspires you to make your own and totally customize it. Also, I know I don't play Dungeons & Dragons and I don't have the proper dice for it. I am very sorry. Please don't get mad at me in the comments. This is just a tutorial. Like I said, I made it for a friend. I've only ever seen a dice tower. Well, obviously I Googled dice towers before making this, but my familiarity with a dice tower is there's this guy on TikTok who uses dice to make up sandwich combinations. So that's when I had first heard of this. After giving it to my friend, he gave me feedback that the bottom should be a little bit flatter because you don't want to be confused about the dice. So if you're making this, you might want to fill it all the way up with resin so the moss doesn't create a bumpy texture. I thought that would be cool, so it could like make it roll more, but in an ideal world it would be a smooth flat bottom. So if you're also making this as a gift, be sure to keep that in mind. But without further ado, here is how I made a dice tower out of cardboard, polymer clay, wood, and resin. For the base of the tower, I used a mailing tube from Uline. I have used these to ship my art in the past, and I have a bunch of extra ones. I measured out the same distance, I believe it was 6 or 7 inches, and marked around so I get a pretty straight, even across line, and I'm using an X-Acto knife to cut it in half. I cut out a hole for the dice to come out of and to be generally like the door, the entryway to the castle, and I marked it out and also cut it out with an X-Acto knife. While I was cutting my cardboard, I figured I should make a few different places for the dice to hit off of that go inside of the tower. Now, this is not something I invented. I looked up other towers. Normally they have kind of things that the dice hit off of. You know, I'm no physicist, but I think this allows the dice to turn different ways, and then I'm gonna have one at the bottom that's really going to encourage the dice to come out, you know, directly onto the place that I'm allowing them to. I don't have a scientific method for this. I just cut it and it wasn't right, so I kept trimming it until it was. I made 2 half circles and then kind of a weird shape for the bottom, which I will show you later because I had to redo it as I was actually gluing them in after baking the whole thing. But now I started to pivot and soften this polymer clay up. It's Sculpey Primo, and it's kind of got like a stone texture. It has like flakes of maybe real stone in it, and it is hard. This was probably the hardest part of this whole process, and my hands were absolutely killing me after this. I rolled it out as much as I could, and obviously it kind of turned into a little bit of a circular shape, and that's not going to work. I need more of a rectangle shape, so I tried to make it more rectangular, and I wasn't being perfect with this process at all because I knew I could piece it together and I was going to be adding a ton of texture. So I was kind of collaging it on and adding little random pieces here and there just because I knew that it would end up looking messy anyway. Once I had the whole thing covered, I tried to smooth it out and I kind of rolled it a little bit, and then I used this, I don't know, some tool that I have. You can use anything to make some straight lines. I ended up doubling these straight lines because these seemed a little bit big, so I ended up making a lot more. And I also used some plastic, and then eventually I also used some foil to create some texture. Ooh, big jump here. I doubled those lines, like I said, and then I was just using this little Cricut tool to make all of these tiny little stones. And then I cut out some square pieces and I added them along the doorway. I made sure it went into the door so it looks nice and cohesive. And then I also made sure to add angles and go back in with some foil to give it some additional texture. At this point, I was ready to make the top part of the tower, so I rolled out some clay, tried to make it the same thickness all the way around, and then I also tried to make it the same width, which can be kind of tricky, but after a little bit of messing around, I finally was able to get it exactly how I wanted it. And then before putting it on, I took it off and made some little cutouts so it has that typical, top of tower shape to it. I also just kind of got lucky that these shapes ended up matching up perfectly in the back because they very well could have not. So you might want to kind of sketch it and plan it out before you do it. Of course, I used my foil to add some texture just to make sure the whole thing is cohesive, and I did this very carefully because it's kind of standing on its own. And then I used this tool again to create some diamond shapes and just some differentiation in that top part. Now, when I had initially thought of this whole plan was going to be based around magnets in this top part so I could hang stuff from it. You could hang badges or animals like a dragon. I love putting magnets in clay. It is very versatile. I ended up not using those at all, but I did, in fact, embed magnets in that top part. So if you want to actually make something, definitely go for it. It worked, but I ended up not making anything additional in those magnets. At this point, I felt like the tower looked a little bit plain, and so my thought was, why don't we add a dying dead tree along it? So I rolled out some dark brown clay. I made sure to taper it so the thickest end was at the base, and then the thin end went towards the top, and I just kind of repeated this exact same thing for all of the branches, and I also added a little bit of texture with that same exact tool. Now, these steps definitely should have been reversed. I should have added some texture and color before I added the branch, but obviously this is my first time doing it, and that's why you're watching this, so I can make these mistakes. But I would definitely do this step before. These are just dry chalk pastels. It's a great way to color polymer clay without making it sticky. You can also mix them with water, and I use this technique to kind of create those like watermarks of like dripping dried water that you sometimes see on old buildings, and I felt like this added a lot of dimension and really made it look nice and aged. Now I'm going to make some stone for along the base, and you might be thinking, where did you get that base from? I cut it out of wood on a day that was 100+ degrees out, so I wasn't in the mood to film in my garage when it was 100 degrees out. So I did cut that out of wood, and then I'm just tearing these little bits of that same clay apart, and I'm tearing it because it creates this really nice natural texture that you might find in very old like hand chipped stone. So I'm just taking that and putting it all the way along the edges. At this point, I decided that it would be cool to make this kind of like a murky swamp situation. So I took some green polymer clay and I took random pieces and placed it throughout. And then where there's no clay is where I decided I was going to put some resin. So it's kind of some like mossy, weird, swampy stuff, and some water is going to be there as well. Now this texture was completely pointless because I ended up finding this product at Michael's that made it look like real moss. So it's going to be entirely covered up. So please ignore that. Next, I put both things in the oven. I also kind of had made a dragon at some point, but we're going to ignore that. I baked it at 275 for 30 minutes on the cardboard, and I had no issues with that. And then I went ahead and painted the inside of this black, and then I changed it to gray. And then I made these little triangular supports to make my life a little bit easier as I'm installing these. I honestly don't know what to call these angled pieces. This just made it so much easier, and it also made it a little bit more durable. Now this is the weird shape of the bottom piece because when I tried the other shape, it ended up not coming out with enough force. So here I am trying it with a little ball of polymer clay because I don't own any dice. Now here is another step where I kind of messed up the order of things. I started to take this baked polymer clay off of the wood and glue it back on to make it permanent, but I forgot that I actually need to paint the wood base blue first, and it's going to be a lot harder to do that once it is glued down, but you know, you live and you learn. I also glued all of the stones, which ended up sticking together, and they kind of broke a little bit, but I glued each piece separately. Here's where I realized, oh my gosh, I've made a mistake, but it's not too late. I started painting the whole wood base this nice teal blue color. I also added a little bit of black in some of the parts that were going to be a little bit more centered, and added a little bit of shading. Then I used E6000 to glue the actual tower in, and I continued to glue the rest of the moss. Now this is the product that I found at Michael's. It's this super cool like micro grass situation. I ended up taking some Mod Podge and I used a brush to cover all of the clay with Mod Podge, and then I very carefully dumped this product all over it and kind of shook it around to make sure it coated everything. And I did definitely have to go back and do a few touch-ups before I was ready to coat the rest of it in resin. I mixed both parts of my resin, and of course I'm wearing gloves and a mask as I'm doing this. Don't ever work with resin without gloves and a mask. I'm just mixing them together with this little stick, and then I also decided at this point that I wanted to color it, so I used two types of alcohol ink. I used this teal color, and then I also added a little bit of blue later on and made sure it was mixed thoroughly before I started to pour it. For the smaller parts, I didn't pour it directly. I would just get some on my skewer and add it to those tiny little areas, and then the largest areas I was able to pour it and then kind of spread it out a little bit to make sure it was in all the places that I wanted it. And this is actually the first coat. I ended up letting it dry and doing some touch-ups to the moss and adding a second coat later. After I was done pouring it, I made sure to hit it with a heat gun to pop all of the bubbles, and then after my second coat, we have our finishing details. I painted the bottom of this wood in a matching gray color. I don't know why I didn't cover it in clay, but whatever. And then this little crack was really bothering me in this top angled thing, so I actually used caulk and I filled in the seams and I repainted it. I also wanted to add some moss to the tower itself, as well as make a little bit more dimension along the wet parts of the moss. So I took some Mod Podge and mixed it with that grass powder sort of stuff, and I just smoothed it in certain cracks along the tower, and then I also added some chunks to add some more dimension. And here is the finished result. I am so happy with how it turned out. I was definitely making stuff up as I go. I definitely wish I had planned just a little bit more, but I love the dimension that the tree has and all the dimension in the water. And I love all the detail along the tower itself. I wish I could have made a dragon or some cool accessories, but you know, it is what it is. But I'm still really proud of myself for figuring this out, even though I had no idea what I was doing. That is it for the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and found it helpful. If you did like this video, let me know what other types of videos you want to see, and feel free to subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, leave them down below. And if you have a question you really want me to answer, feel free to send me a DM on Instagram. That's just where I'm most likely to reply. I don't look at the YouTube comments quite as much anymore because they're not particularly nice, so I try to stay away from YouTube. So if you have a question about this that you really want me to answer, feel free to send me a DM on Instagram and I will probably respond on there. But thank you so much for watching. I hope I'm going to do some more long format videos coming up. I always say that I am, and then life gets in the way and I totally forget. It's kind of hard to film in both orientations at the same time, but I do have a few videos filmed. Hopefully I'll be able to get them out soon. But yeah, again, thank you so much and happy making.